It's 5 to 7. He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them on someone.
Well, here we are again. Welcome to Islands at War podcast with myself, Keith Vangeli, and
Nick Lahire.
Greetings to you. So we are now, Nick, July 1941, and quite a lot going on, as always. We've also had a couple of emails come in from Kester and from Simon, and we'll be addressing those at the end of this podcast. So, you know the score. We talk for an hour or so. I pose some questions and Nick answers them. And Nick, we normally sort of talk about the food or lack of it during the occupation, and this month we decided that there wasn't too much to say that was other than be repetitive, but you've got something to do with bread.
Bread was finally rationed middle of the month in July, which then meant you're down to the only thing that wasn't actually rationed by that time in the way of foodstuffs, anything you find growing on a hedge, so blackberries, that sort of stuff. That was literally it. That was the only thing that wasn't rationed, which is quite a scary thought, and that's July 1941. We've got another 4 years to go.
Yeah, people were foraging, of course. They were picking up acorns and they were picking up bramble leaves for tea, as we discussed last week.
Yeah.
Pretty bleak. And I always wonder how my poor gran got on with looking after the members of the family.
I found another thing as well, which quite surprised me, which was, it's sort of food related. There was a notice in the paper in July where people had to register if they had a refrigerator. Now, those were not very common in Guernsey, but you had to register what type of refrigerator, make, model, whether it was powered by electricity or gas, and you had to register them. Presumably, I would imagine, because the Germans wanted to get their hands on them.
Well, not only that, I think there is this Germanic desire to control everything, and went to inordinate lengths to do so. I also noticed Herbert Winterflood, late Herbie Winterflood, has brought some stuff together from the newspaper during that time. The Licensed Victuallers Association are offering a £5 fine, or £5 reward rather, for information leading to people being apprehended because people are stealing glasses from licensed premises.
It's still going on in those days.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, I think there was more of an imperative in those days.
I think the problem really was that you couldn't get replacements, or very difficult to get replacements for these things. So,
or for anything, really.
Yeah, or for anything. So people were just wandering off with them. You know, if you broke a few glasses at home, wander off with a couple from the pub.
Yeah. Also, and one of these orders from the Germans that sort of now looking back seems to defy belief, but an order that radios are not to be installed in vehicles.
Yeah.
I mean, hardly anyone had a vehicle.
Yeah, exactly. And also in this month, there was a notice published saying that your driving permit would be expire at the end of the month. So, you know, unless you had you had to re-register again to get another driving permit. So if you're like a doctor or somebody, some form of essential worker, then you could potentially
people like vets or certain civil servants that needed to go and check up on things out in the rural areas, they would have had cars, government cars and things.
Yeah.
I think listeners know by now that we source a lot of information, not only from Nick's archive of newspapers, but also the published diaries that have come out, some better than others. But one of the ones I was looking at is a diary, Nick, from chap J.C. Sovery, who lived in the north of the island in St. Sampson's, an area known as the Bridge, which is a small town in the north of the island. His diary is well worth seeking out. He was a churchman, not a minister, but a member of the church in that area. And he was a carpenter, had a carpentry works. And it really is a quite touching diary. His wife had died just prior to the occupation, and his family had gone away. And he was left on his own. And it really is a diary at a different pace. It's more commonplace, but very charming. And one of the things he puts in, Nick, it's weather related for July. July was incredibly hot, which was a huge contrast to the weather that had gone before.
Yeah, they'd had pretty shocking weather all the way through, right up until into June. It was, in fact, June was one of the worst. The weather was some of the worst weather experienced in June for many, many years. I think we touched on that in last month's podcast, in the June 1941 episode.
And it had gone to the other end of the spectrum. A lot of diarists commenting just how incredibly hot it actually was. And Savory goes on to say that he notices German troops playing football and swimming and outdoor skittles. This would have been in the Delancey area above his house and along the Belgrave Bay, along our seacoast north of St. Peter Port. And Savory comments on how they spend all day in shorts and not much else. And other diarists pick up on that Germans absolutely relishing the weather. And Savory goes on to say, I am sure they are getting a good time, and they seem to be undressed all day. And by what I hear, they say that there is no place like Guernsey.
Yeah, well, we'll come to that in a bit, because we've got some information which might sort of explain why they are quite so happy to be here compared to elsewhere.
Compared to further east, that's for sure. And also, Savory goes on to note now that the Red Cross offices that had previously been in Elizabeth College, which is our preparatory school here, have moved away, and they were now right in the middle of St. Peter Port, above Burton's, which is still there, although the premises is no longer open as a shop. So now the Red Cross offices smack in the middle of St. Peter Port in the high street, Nick.
Yeah, there was another development on Red Cross messages as well, which was from July you were allowed to send one message a month from Guernsey, which was an improvement, because they had to basically get a letter, a Red Cross message, and be able to reply to it.
So that you could actually initiate a Red Cross message now.
Yeah, you could initiate one a month.
Okay, so yeah, was it 25 words you could send?
It started out as 10, eventually got up to 25. Yeah. I'm not sure at what point it went up to 25 off the top of my head.
I think it was around the July time. And so once a month you could go along to the Red Cross offices and just hand in your 25 words.
25 words is not very much to them.
Yeah, and for listeners, essentially what people were doing were writing to loved ones in the UK, which would have been civilians, really. They were writing to their parents or children.
Yeah.
Not to people in the armed forces.
Yeah, they were writing to civilians in the UK. The messages took absolutely ages. You were looking at about 3 months to send a message and then get a response. It varied depending on disruption by Allied bombing and stuff.
Yeah, and across Europe. Lost. You know.
Yeah, and stuff. Yeah, well, there was certainly, I know of at least one ship which was sunk, which was heading for Portugal, because a lot of them went through Portugal. Was heading there and was sunk, and it had Red Cross messages on it. But
yeah, of course, Portugal was a neutral country. Throughout the war. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, we turn now to some comments from the Reverend Ord, his fine diary. The Butchers Association report that 50% of its delivery vehicles have been taken off the road due to their tyres being requisitioned.
Yeah, I think we mentioned this in June 41, that there was a notice where tyres were not to be thrown away or used for other purposes and things like that. So, yeah, there was a lack of tyres to put on vehicles, even if you had one. Now, I did see something the other day, which happens later on in the war, where a chap who'd been an upholsterer and had to find other things to do, and noted was that one of the things he'd been doing was making bags for shopping so that people could go and actually collect their rations. But he also mentioned that he'd been making soles for shoes out of old car tyres. So clearly he didn't hand in the old car tyres that he had because he was doing that. But Ord also speculated in his diary slightly earlier on, when the notice about tyres in the previous month came out, if they're doing so well, how come they need our old tyres?
Yes. Well, of course, it was very much necessity being the mother of invention during the occupation. Ord also talks about more and more evictions as new troops arrived. Troop strength was increasing at this time. Military strength was increasing on the islands. And could you just talk us through about these evictions? Because they were pretty brutal, weren't they?
Yeah, they were. We talked about one particular case in the June 41 episode, but there are various accounts of what goes on. I mean, they basically, there's one A.C. Robin in an unpublished diary noted that a German officer had called at his office. He was actually an official here in the government, and asked him to be at his house at 3 p.m. as he wanted to view the house. Now, this was going on. The Germans were issuing permits to German officers to go and take over houses. They'd been in a lot of places like the Duke of Richmond Hotel and sort of those style of properties, but they kind of wrecked them. And also the German officers were looking at some of these grander houses and thinking, I fancy living there, actually, just, with a couple of other officers rather than a whole load of us all in one space. So they were issuing these permits, but if they were still trying it on, even if they didn't have one. So this particular German officer, Robin notes that Robin himself had a letter from the Controller Committee warning that questions of billeting or finding quarters must not be entertained unless the officer is armed with written authority. So when this German turns up at 3 p.m, he has a bit of a Barney with him about the fact that he's not going to let him view the house. No, you're not coming in. And eventually he went away.
So this is there are certain, as you say, probably middle ranking to senior officers thought they could just try their luck
exactly.
and the weight of their appearance would carry them through, but some people were standing up to them.
Yeah, I mean, the other problem as well was that they might view a house and decide that they're taking it, and despite the fact that there were registers of contents being taken, they were taking stuff out of the house that they didn't want, or in some cases actually shipping furniture back to Germany.
But they were looting.
Yeah, basically. And anything that they didn't want in the house, they were sticking on a bonfire. So your stuff could be going up in smoke.
Yeah, I mean, the billeting records here are not as detailed as I thought they were, because I looked. You can find out how many military were. And I'm talking about our archives here on the island. I looked into this, and you can get an idea of how many combatants were staying in a property and what the property was, but it doesn't give any German names and it doesn't give any ranks or anything like that.
No, and you can look at the list of contents so they had local estate agents, stroke auctioneers who knew what these things were, going round to properties supposedly before the Germans occupied, and making a list of the contents so that, at the end of the war, they could, in theory, be returned to you. How successful?
Yes, that's right. Because I did just to digress very slightly, there was a property along the road at Ekar, which is on our south coast, near to where we had various raids, and the Germans destroyed a house there that had belonged to Victor Hugo's family, and it was lots of the furniture from there was taken in varying degrees, taken down to places like the Captain's Hotel with Germans. So this house had been abandoned, and the Germans were taking effects and furniture to where they were staying, but it was very, very carefully controlled.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of discipline, but it would seem that certain German officers were prepared to try their luck. The house next door had German officers billeted in during the war, but I couldn't find out too many details there. Okay, so was there anything else we got on this eviction? What I have is that Ord talks about, I mentioned the brutality behind it. Ord hears of a man and an infant evicted, though the mother is severely ill in hospital, and the husband and the child had nowhere to go. I mean, they'd have been taken in eventually by somebody, but the Germans did not care for the welfare of the people that they were evicting.
No, it was basically you've got until 4:00, get as much stuff out as you can, find some way of transporting it, and go to wherever you can. There was no effort made by them to rehouse these people.
No, by the time we get to 1944, we'll be able to go to a real live episode where somebody ended up coming to live in my house here, but we'll get to that in due course. Another diarist, Edith Carey, she was living out by the airport in a parish called the Forest, next to St Martin's. But Carey writes that someone in St Martin's has written for the public to see, long live General de Gaulle, which I thought was a bit random. But they must have been hearing de Gaulle's broadcast on the BBC, because people still had radios.
Yeah, they did. Now, de Gaulle was obviously broadcasting, but what you have to remember as well, it may well have been a Guernseyman, but there were a lot of French people who were here during the occupation that had been trapped here by the occupation, because there is a reasonably large French population here.
Yes, and we're going to do a deep dive into the V for Victory signs later in this podcast, and as a French gentleman got punished, an innocuous thing there. But also going on for Ord, he comments on the newly arriving troops that they appear slovenly, wear their unkempt uniforms, and he notices, because Ord had been a military man in the First World War, that even their belts and holsters are without polish. Now, you think some of these troops had already been in action?
Yeah, they had. The A.C. Robin talks in his diary about encountering a couple of Germans that had actually seen action in Crete, and they talked of appalling losses in men and material, and they were actually denouncing Hitler when they were talking to him. They said, he records that they told him that the war communiques were described as a pack of lies, and the BBC news on German losses was not exaggerated. I
mean, that was quite something for them to come out with this.
Yeah, quite risky. They were obviously pretty annoyed. And they'd been in action in Crete. They talked about the attack on Crete being senseless, carried out without any regard for losses of men and material. On their way to Guernsey, they'd been able to get some leave for 10 days. It took them a hell of a long time to get home. Troop trains kept getting bombed. One of them said when he started to get nearer to home, no trains were running. He ended up getting occasional lifts on farm wagons, or had to walk, and it took him days to reach Mannheim. He couldn't even get a bicycle for love nor money. But what really upset him was when he got nearer home, he saw roofs and windows damaged in many of the villages, and had the shock of his life. He said that he told Robin that the town was a heap of ruins, and when he got to where his house was, it was just a pile of rubble.
Yes, but I'm just interested about Crete, because my knowledge of the German attack on Crete was airborne, wasn't it?
Yeah.
But there must have been other military units there, because we're not suggesting German paratroopers were billeted in Guernsey.
No.
Because when the name Crete comes up, it's what I initially think of. So Ord also hears of 2 Germans who have actually committed suicide following the news that their wives had been killed in British or during the course of British raids on Germany.
That wasn't particularly uncommon, but also the other repercussion of it was that you see reports of Germans threatening to shoot people if they find out that shoot five civilians here if their family are killed in the bombing of Germany.
Oh, you mean people, sort of German troops, sort of in their grief, unilaterally threatening people?
Yeah, threatening that if it happens, that they're not people who've already know that their families have died, but the whether it's rumor or not, I don't know, but I have seen it recorded in a number of diaries where there's Germans saying that if my family get harmed, I'll kill 5 Guernsey people.
Yes, I mean, we often forget that we think of German troops, German military being here in some way cosseted, because they're nowhere. Okay, yes, there were raids, and in fact, we're going to talk about RAF activity during July. But these combatants themselves were worried about their families, because I think in a very short space of time, Britain appeared to be on the ropes, but was taking the war into the German homeland.
Yeah, absolutely. And there was a lot of RAF activity around the Channel Islands as well in July 41, because the British were getting back on their feet after the Battle of Britain, and they obviously wanted to take the fight back to the Germans. So there's a lot of records of people here hearing and seeing the bombing of Cherbourg, because obviously they couldn't see Cherbourg itself, but the Cherbourg Peninsula, and they could hear the bombing, because it was fairly heavy bombing raids going on Cherbourg, for example, but it didn't mean that the Channel Islands themselves weren't bombed. And I always find, when I'm talking to people who aren't from the island, and even, some people, many people actually, that are from the island, they've got not a clue that the RAF were bombing positions here on the Channel Islands, mostly because these, I use the word carefully, were sort of precision raids, as precise as you could be in those days. But they were singling out targets that were, hopefully well away from civilian areas.
Yeah, well, we have discussed in the past. I mean, there was Ralph Duran's diary talks about casualties in these raids and getting it hopelessly wrong, overestimated by hundreds. But my father talked about raids where he'd heard that hundreds of Germans got killed, but nothing like that in terms of number. But we should remember that many of the German, if not all of the German sites that the RAF would have looked at civilians weren't allowed anyway. So you could sort of go after these sites almost with impunity.
Yeah.
There was not really going to be any collateral damage, apart from slave workers, of course. They might get caught in it. But
yeah, these, it's probably worth mentioning, these were mostly low-level attacks, so that, you didn't have the risk that bombs were going to be miles and miles away from where they were supposed to be, and then hitting things. It tended to be a much lower level attack.
Yeah, and so would there have been a mission? So in other words, there was a mission to take off from the UK and go and perform a precision raid in Guernsey, or were they opportunist raids where planes were coming back from France or something, having been over France?
Bit of both.
Yeah,
but if you look at the ones in July 41, they look more like it was intended, because they're where the areas where they hit are houses that have got gun positions outside of them. So they're clearly the gun crews are probably billeted in those houses. They're attacking actually where the guns are. And then 2nd of July, there's a report that there were 5 bombs dropped 12:40 a.m. at La Rochère near Torteville Church. House, barn and greenhouse were damaged. And then there's another one a bit later on, 7th of July, where bombs were dropped behind a house in St Andrews and St Saviour's as well. And these were all areas where the Germans had taken over and put guns in front of the houses. So there were no civilian casualties on that occasion, although one cow was killed at shrapnel by Candy in the Catel.
Which is that and that area is pretty rural, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. The number of, especially at that time, it would have been, the number of Germans wounded is said to be heavy, as they are trying to get beds at the emergency hospital, which was the civilian hospital. Their own hospital accommodation at OGH Victoria Hospital and the mental home, etc., must be taxed for them to be doing this. He puts a question mark at the end of that, as it's obviously a rhetorical question. And he also notes, then the other thing to do with attacks by the RAF around here was they were attacking the shipping that was coming this way. So he goes on to say, there is apparently some truth in the report of a sinking of a troop ship last Wednesday. German soldiers say they lost 1,000 or 1,600 men and 5 horses. Civilian employees at Cherbourg fortifications saw bombs dropping on a vessel, but were ordered away to dugouts. One of the armed trawlers came back with 200 men, the other had none. So I can't see any shipping losses recorded.
No.
When I had a look, so whether it was just the ship was damaged, or whether it's just wishful thinking that so many Germans had been sunk, I don't know.
I mean, it makes you wonder, given that the fact that the Channel Islands were pretty much considered by any military expert to have no strategic value. In 1941, and the British were still on their own, it makes you wonder why they did this. What was the point of it? Was it almost a sort of live training exercise?
No, I think they were trying to disrupt German activity. They were still contemplating trying to take the islands back. So you don't want to allow them to build up even more forces here. You've got to remember Churchill was upset.
So it was harassment and disruption.
Yeah, disruption. Or just trying to stop them from fortifying the island quite as much. There were a number of operations that were planned to varying degrees to come to try and take back the islands. So, you don't want to give them the chance to build things up beforehand.
And troop strength, let's say, in order to get some perspective, troop strength, military strength towards the end of 1940, what, about 1,000 military on Guernsey?
Something like that, maybe a little bit more.
Yeah, in July, you've got a figure here of much greater than that.
Yeah, the couple of the accounts one talks about 10,000, and I don't think it was that many.
No.
By this stage. That's later on in the occupation. But this account talks about 7,000. I've seen others that say between 5 and 7. So I haven't really looked at it. It's difficult to follow because unless you go and research that as a specific topic,
yeah.
They're coming and going.
But the important thing is the fact that, let's say there was 7,000 German military here. We have got a division between the Luftwaffe, the Kriegsmarine, the Navy, and the Wehrmacht.
Yeah.
And is it around this point that although the Wehrmacht had the numbers, the Kriegsmarine were actually handed over the task of effectively running the defences of the island on the basis of we're going to be invaded, it's going to come from the sea.
Going to come from the sea.
So at this point, Nick, and I'm sort of throwing this off you, we haven't prepped this, but what would you say the ratio over that 7 is? I mean, in terms of Luftwaffe, had the crack squadrons moved on?
They've
gone to Russia, I think, haven't they?
Well, and also they'd pulled out a lot of them, even fairly early on in the occupation, purely because of British bombing of the airport and stuff like that. So aircraft would come and go, but they weren't staying here.
There was no ongoing Luftwaffe strength here, really.
There was at the airport in terms of
running the airport,
anti-aircraft positions, that kind of thing. That you had Luftwaffe manning the flak batteries.
Oh, okay, so flak batteries around the airport would have been Luftwaffe. Yep. They wouldn't have been Wehrmacht troops.
Correct.
Yeah.
So you had that, but then the aircraft would come and go at various times. They'd be here for a few days or whatever.
And that continued right through to the very end, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Albeit from D-Day. It was
much less, yeah.
Much less. I mean, after
and we'll get on to that.
After D-Day, it took them until October before the first aircraft got here.
Yeah. So Luftwaffe had a diminished strength here. So then if we look at, in terms of 7,000 people, what we talked about, 500 Luftwaffe maybe?
I have no idea. I've not looked at it.
But it's pretty small. So the rest of that sort of, the meat, as it were, of that, the Kriegsmarine ratio to the Wehrmacht, again, was relatively small, but they were handed control, weren't they?
They did have control, but I've got no idea on the numbers. It's not something I've looked at.
It's something that we could perhaps look at, because the islands are being fortified to be held, and I know that when I was looking after the Kriegsmarine station, communication station outside St. Peter Port, although it hadn't yet moved to that bunker when the function was there, I think that reading the Kriegsmarine had sort of reluctantly assumed control of the defences of the island for invasion.
Yeah, they were in charge of that. There's no doubt.
Yeah. Okay, so we move on here. So we talked about the RAF activity. I want to get into the chalking up of writing up of V signs as a form of protest, or I don't know if you'd call it resistance, but certainly a sign of the fact that people were not taking the occupation line down, so to speak. It's quite a big subject. You've done quite a lot here, which is fantastic. Can we sort of talk through how it started, what initiated it, and how it played out with punishments exactly?
Yeah, okay. So the campaign wasn't aimed at the Channel Islands, this campaign. It was something that was started by a Belgian politician and broadcaster who'd been assigned to the BBC. He was a chap, he was actually 3-time Olympian president and Minister of Justice in Belgium. But he'd escaped, he was assigned to the BBC. He was really well known in Belgium, actually. And he found success in the UK working with the BBC, with broadcasting to Belgium under the voice of Radio Belgique. Broadcasting in French and so the European, a large part of the European continent could understand what he was saying. Now he came up with this idea during the course of an air raid and decided that this would be a great way of showing the Germans that people might be occupied, but they certainly weren't giving in easily. So he came up with this idea, and another chap he worked with at the BBC, who was a news editor, a chap called Douglas Ritchie, took on the pseudonym of Colonel Britain. And Colonel Britain broadcast on the BBC to Europe and suggested this idea of V signs, V for victory. It was endorsed by Churchill by middle of July, saying it's a good idea. The idea being that you would do various things with these Vs in various different ways to sort of show a bit of defiance, really.
Yes, right. Yeah, defiance.
So it wasn't aimed at the Channel Islands, and Colonel Britain was suggesting things like you would sit in cafes or other public places with your legs arranged in a V shape, cutting out paper Vs and leaving them lying around just to annoy the Germans, as well as chalking stuff on walls or painting stuff on roads. And even down to, if you go and knock on someone's door, you do three short knocks and one loud one for the Morse code for V.
Yes, because isn't this sort of tie-in with the start of a piece of music by Beethoven?
It does. Yeah, indeed. And so that was a way of showing resistance. So that got picked up on by the islanders, who were obviously still listening to the BBC at this stage because they were allowed to. The wirelesses hadn't been taken away at this point. Or rather, they'd been taken away, given back in Christmas,
yes, that's right,
1940. So, as I say, not directed at the islands, but very much picked up, and Guernsey people became very keen conscripts in the V Army, as Colonel Britain called it.
But it is synonymous with Churchill, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It is, and I guess that's partly where this Belgian chap got the idea from. Was Churchill wandering around doing his V sign and whatever, and this is perhaps where they came up with the idea. Now, the theory is that the reason it wasn't specifically aimed at the Channel Islands was because of the precariousness of the position here. You couldn't escape. It might make things a little bit more difficult for islanders. But islanders certainly took it on to a great extent, some of which is down to school kids thinking, well, this is a brilliant idea, I can get away with a bit of vandalism, and I can do a bit of graffiti or whatever. So there was that aspect of it, but also it was seriously taken on. And so on the 4th of July, there's a notice from the bailiff notifying the public that the island is threatened with severe punishment unless people chalking up the letter V own up to doing this very grave offence within the next 72 hours, which is then followed by another notice on the 9th of July offering a £25 reward for information which will lead to the conviction of persons still posting up the letter V. Some half a dozen small boys of 10 and 11 years old were carted away from Cattell School with much kicking and howling to appear before the commandant. Now, this is really strange. The next bit of this, obviously, he must have just gone, it's just kids being naughty, because they returned an hour and a half later to the delight of their parents, who had meanwhile assembled at the school. They returned with a pocket full of chocolate, and one or two had cigarettes for their parents. So it says the worst boy, Edmund Corbin, was caught red-handed by a soldier. Now, this is brilliant. He was watching German signwriters who were painting up arrows, numbers and letters at crossroads using different colours of paint. Now that's how they had found their way around the road system here, because all the road signs had been taken down. So the Germans had routes painted around the island. You had red, yellow.
Red and yellow in particular, and for local people driving along our west coast, if you were travelling north from the southwest tip of the island, you'll see a huge 79 painted on the gable of a house in red and yellow. And that was the red and yellow colour. I know we're sort of slightly digressing. That was, I think, universal, wasn't it?
No, you had red and yellow, and for the moment I can't remember what they were. Blue and white, I think it was. So one was north-south, the other was east-west.
Right.
So that and they had roads that were numbered. So that's why the Germans were busy painting things. But this schoolboy,
Corbyn.
the boy Corbyn, took the opportunity to dip his pen into the red paint and draw a large V beside the kneeling soldier. Now Corbyn did a runner, but before the German could get up on his feet, because obviously this guy was crouching down doing it, but eventually he was caught by another one. So that's how they ended up getting into trouble, albeit they got sweets and cigarettes, so it wasn't really that much trouble. Now, somebody who did get into trouble for this whole V-sign notice in the paper offering a reward was the bailiff, Victor Carey.
Yeah, well, the bailiff, we just have a recap. He was the sort of titular head of the Guernsey government, wasn't he?
Yeah, and so he had his name appended to this notice in the paper. And in old records that, a lot of people said, well, his name's Mud because, he shouldn't be offering a reward for this. But a lot of people realised,
his hand was forced.
Yeah, exactly. And Ord even notes the tone of the words in the diary, that in the notice, that it was clearly issued by the Germans and he was made to do it. Now, in fact, Carey was questioned about this notice in June 1945 after the liberation, and he took full responsibility for appending his signature, stating that it followed a very stormy interview with the Feldkommandant. The threats made at that meeting combined in Carey's mind with his knowledge that a list of 80 potential hostages for execution or deportation to a concentration camp had already been gathered.
Okay, so the German authorities had nominated 80 civilians, and this is not just a threat. They'd actually had a list of names.
Yeah, they had a list of names of.
So this was a real and severe threat. Carey was fully of the understanding that these people could actually be put up against the wall and shot.
And they had formed. They hadn't shot anybody here, but they had. You've got to go and remember they'd sent off Ambrose Sherwell, the Attorney General. He'd been sent to prison in France. He was back in Guernsey by this point. But the view was taken that Carey said he was eager to prevent widespread reprisals, and he agreed to sign, stating his belief that the majority of the population realised these notices bore my signature, but they were really German. And if you're presented with that situation, these were it was basically the 80 most prominent people in Guernsey.
Yeah, Carey himself was quite an old gentleman, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was. He was elderly, which is why until he got deported, Ambrose Sherwell was kind of running the show.
Yeah.
So that's why he agreed to do it. And the threat must have been very, very real. They knew what the Germans were behaving like, on the continent to a certain extent, because they were getting told these things by the French captains that were on the boats that were bringing over the supplies. When if the boat was here for overnight or for a couple of days, they'd quite often speak to the captain. In particular, one ship, the Spinel, the captain seemed to speak to quite a few people, because he's recorded in a number of the diaries that they'd meet him in the pub or down near the harbour, not actually on the harbour, because the civilians couldn't go onto the harbour. And he'd be telling them what was going on, things like that he'd been, his ship had almost been bombed. Had fallen 500 metres away from the stern of his boat when he was leaving Granville. That was in July 1941. So, he was able to pass on news. He even brought over, news sheets from France, which were telling people what was going on. So the threat was very real. The dissent wasn't confined to schoolboys, was it? I mean, in Carey's diary, she talks about a Frenchman was explaining to somebody about the V signs, and he actually drew a V sign on the saddle of his bike, and then couldn't erase it. And the person he'd shown it to, as just an indication, went and reported him. And he was hauled up and deported back to France. And one of the things he was saying is, take it out on me, but don't take it out on the islanders. But
the chalking up or the painting up of these signs, as they say, it was not confined to school children.
Oh,
was
no,
it?
no. That was just one example that I found, and there are references that the school children just thought it was a bit of a hoot,
A jape
to do it, but no, it was very seriously being done. Was widespread. Yeah, the chap that was deported was a chap. Now I'm probably going to murder this name, Xavier de Guilbon. He was actually a one-legged Frenchman who lived in Guernsey. He was a farmer down at Grand Rock, and he chalked that on a bicycle seat. Now, I believe he also chalked it elsewhere as well. So it's not purely the case, but it was somebody that he'd had a falling out with. Actually,
oh, well, it was always the case.
That had dobbed him in, but he got a really long prison sentence.
Yeah.
He got 12 months.
Yeah.
He was sent to Caen prison, and the feeling was that he was just basically being made an example of. This is what,
without making an example of a local person. So he really took some flack, didn't he?
And two Jersey people were also deported, but they got 9 months. They were all sentenced at the same time and sent to Caen prison. But you see other reports. Monday the 14th of July, the V sign in Jersey has led to the imposition of a 6 p.m. curfew and the confiscation of wireless sets in 1 or 2 districts. Residents of St Martin's in Guernsey yesterday afternoon also were in trouble. So that's probably related to the scrawling of the "Long live de Gaulle" up there.
Yeah, well, one of the examples I read is that there was a hotel which is now known to people here. Local listeners would know it was the Wicked Wolf, but it was called for many years the Colton, and before that the Bowlier. And it was said that the B signs were seen in that area. So the Germans basically took a pen and drew a radius of 1 mile around the Bowlier and said, right, people need to, they had local men standing guard and that, didn't they?
They had to go and guard, in that case, they had to go and guard the notice boards, the official German notice boards outside the hotel. You had to supply 2 men every night to do that, and various other places around St Martin's. They also confiscated their radios for a short period of time.
Yeah, well, then my family would have been within that radius. They were living, within that radius, as I say. But, there were no young men in it, or it was just elderly family.
Yeah, and the chap that got hard labour, other reports refer to him also chalking up V's on military cars. So maybe that's why he got a little bit more time,
more targeted. Yeah, and I would think they get a bit more. The Germans a little bit more excised about that. Okay, so what else have we got on that? Yes, you talked about here on the midnight of the 20th, Colonel Britton read out a message from Churchill.
Yes, so this was Churchill endorsing it. The V sign is the symbol of the occupied territories and a portent of the fate awaiting the Nazi tyranny. So long as the peoples of Europe continue to refuse all collaboration with the invader, it is sure that his cause will perish and that Europe will be liberated. So that was actually the first time that Churchill had endorsed the use of this campaign. But the Germans then went on to start adopting it themselves.
Well, yes, didn't they signify it by putting some leaves, ivy leaves,
laurel leaves along the bottom. You can see one on the Grange actually.
Yes,
if you're coming down, for those listeners that are local, if you're coming down the Grange just before you get to the traffic lights at the end of Doyle Road, I think it's about 3rd or 4th house up on the right, you can still see it's preserved there. You can see that there are a few others about, but
that particular one, I'm 66 and it's been there since the war, because I remember seeing it and looking out for it on the bus into town from the very, very early 60s. So that's been preserved, hasn't it? Of course, at the time, I couldn't understand why a symbol that the Germans detested had been preserved by the Germans, but of course what they were trying to do is turn it back, weren't they?
Yeah, they basically came up. Ord makes a great observation. He says that in his diary on the 23rd, the V sign has surely turned the German brain. A huge article on the front page of the paper today, and that was basically the Germans explaining why V meant victory for Germany on all fronts, and it was a response by Goebbels, the propaganda minister in Germany, that this is what we're going to do about these V signs. So they started putting V's on their cars to go with, because the cars that have been taken off the civilian population and being used by the Germans had a WH on them, and they started putting a V so that it, victory for the Wehrmacht.
So they were trying to hijack it to try and dilute it, weren't they? As a symbol of resistance.
Yeah, absolutely. So they were trying to persuade people that it was all their idea, really, and they found it all very funny. They also had a habit of painting W's, and they looked like two V's. The other thing people did, apart from painting V signs, was on occupied houses, they'd go and put a V in the dust on the windows and things like that, just to annoy them even more.
Well, it didn't take much to annoy the Germans. Their nerves were getting a bit frayed at the time. What I want to do now, did you have any more on V signs?
No, I think that's probably it for V signs. They were fairly widespread, and as I say, you tended to get reprisals in the form of having to go and do things like guard things for a few weeks, and then they'd finally get bored. It's a bit like when the telephone wire got cut near the airport, and they made those. They had to supply men to go and walk up and down the phone line holding on to it to prove it wasn't.
Yeah, so this is all disobedience, but it still just shows the spirit of resistance.
Yeah, it's kind of defiance, really. Defiance, isn't it? Yeah, I think it's probably a good cause. I've just noticed in my notes as well, actually, on the 18th of July, there was a report circulating that a British plane of machine gun troops on the west coast yesterday morning at 10:30 and inflicted some casualties. So that was the kind of attack that was going on.
Yeah, yes. Well, thanks for that, Nick. What I want to do now in the final few minutes is we consistently encourage listeners to get in touch. People can get in touch at occupied@gnetradio.com. And we're always pleased to receive communications. And we've had a couple. I'll just refer to the one from Simon. Thank you very much, Simon. We know who you are. And we will be covering the story of your great-grandfather, Ernest Brewer. We are aware of it, but anything further that you can add to that, Nick, we would be very grateful to know. And possibly, Simon, if you find significant family memories of that, perhaps you'd come in and do a little spot about this particularly.
Yeah, that'd be really interesting, actually.
Because we know Simon has got media experience, so it'd be fantastic for you to come in. So we'll get in touch with you, Simon, about that, because it's a significant story, and November 41 isn't too far away.
No, in terms of our recordings, it really isn't.
So, Simon, we will be in touch with you. Now, another person that follows the podcast very closely, and we're very grateful, is Kester. I met Kester out at Fort Grey when he was visiting for business reasons, and I'll just go through this because there's quite a lot here. Kester, you write, thanking us for the links for further reading. You will research various things, and we will be doing a book review podcast with Steve Foote in the very near future, talking about the diaries and books that he's been publishing, which will include the Van Alphes diaries, which have come out this week, I think.
They have, yeah.
Yeah, which is a tremendous book. I'm engaged in that at the moment. And you have some further questions. The first question is triggered from the line in Jim Delbridge's song. This is our song 5 to 7, which we open and close with. The line, Winston's gone and left us all alone. And are you right? Did the Guernsey residents hold an opinion that the UK, and Winston Churchill in particular, took a decision not to defend the islands? And if so, was there some bitterness? So Nick, would you cover that off?
I've done quite a bit on this. I've got an article on. You can find it on my website, islandfortress.com. It's where I talk about Hitler, whether Churchill abandoned us to Hitler or not. And I think the answer is quite complicated, because if you'd asked Mr. Lahire from Torteville in 1945, he might have said, yeah, he did, because he wouldn't have had the information.
Well, my father had that.
Well, yeah,
opinion, yeah.
But he wouldn't have had the information that is available now. So at the time that this predominantly comes also from the Let 'em Starve comment, which was the 80th anniversary of yesterday. where he scribbled a note on some cabinet meetings saying, "Let 'em starve. There shall be no fighting on Guernsey, or on the Channel Islands, can't remember which." And people interpret that differently, as whether it meant the German troops, whether it meant the civilian population as well. The cabinet papers that it was on were actually in relation to an attempt that had been made to get the Germans to surrender, where an officer had come here on a boat from France at great risk to try and negotiate a surrender. So, if you know that, you think, well, he's not forgotten about us. There's also all the, as I mentioned earlier, the numerous plans to retake the islands starting from March 41 February 41 onwards. There, every year there were different plans that came up with. There were questions in the House of Lords and in the Commons all the time about the Channel Islands, particularly Lord Portsea brought up stuff. So, if you know all of that, you think, well, no, they haven't been forgotten. Churchill himself was absolutely flipping furious that we did surrender the islands. We didn't.
Was he actually Prime Minister when the Germans arrived?
He did. He was. Yeah.
But only just
only a few weeks into being Prime Minister.
Yeah, and then so that's Kester also picks up. Given that the islands were not defended, and quoting again Jim Delbridge's lyrics, no one told Hitler on the phone. So why did the Germans choose to bomb with their planes? In other words, why was the opening salvos an air raid? Surely, as Kester writes, given the circumstances, it would have been made more sense and used fewer resources to just launch a sea attack and capture the island without a shot being fired. Now, there were plans in order to in the due course of events, to mount a sea invasion.
Yeah, there was Operation Green Arrow. They were going to invade by boat from France. This bombing raid was basically sent over to come and bomb stuff in advance of that. What they mistook were civilian trucks at the harbour for being military vehicles. Attacked those, bombed bits of the harbour, and attacked Jersey as well, and the lifeboat on its way.
Okay, to put this in perspective then, because we all know that the fall of France was so rapid, it sort of overtook sort of military planning, didn't it? So at what point would we have expected a German invasion to have a seaborne invasion of the Channel Islands to have been formulated almost right at the start of the war? Or was it thought up as the Germans progressed through France? I mean, the bombing raid and the eventual airborne invasion of the Channel Islands overtook all that, didn't it? Because of the sheer speed of events unfolding.
Yeah, they'd already planned it. I don't know when they started planning it, but they had already planned it because
and presumably allocated resources.
Yeah, because they'd already, there was a lot of German air activity in the week between the last civilian evacuation boats going, other than the regular mail boats which you could pay to go on yourself. There'd been a lot of German activity, just trying to assess what was going on in the islands. So this was part of the softening up.
So what was it, Operation Green Arrow? Is this the details of this available?
Yeah, you can go and find information on it. Whether you can actually find out when they initially started planning it, don't know, because I haven't looked, to be fair.
No, because I just wonder what they would have used, because one associates landing craft.
Yeah, no, they haven't. They've got no landing craft.
No one had sort of invented the landing craft yet.
They had no landing craft. They'd have
been launches or something.
It'd have been barges and other types of ships and stuff. Quite how it would have worked, don't know, because I haven't actually looked at the German plans for it. But it was overtaken by events, because the Luftwaffe landed at the airport here, having seen that there was nothing really going on in terms of aircraft there. Went and had a look around and realised very quickly that actually there was no military opposition here. Yeah. So went back, reported back, and then on the 30th, we were invaded by air. They came in Junkers 52s, and that's how that happened.
Well, I'd be interested in looking at the detail of that Operation Green Arrow. Maybe there's a sort of material there for a bit of a special.
I'm sure probably if you look through some of the occupation reviews, there's stuff on it, but it's not something I've looked at in great detail, because I've tended to concentrate on what's been going on here.
Yeah, and so excellent point raised there, Kester. Kester also goes on to say, was there any point in killing 33 people who were completely unarmed, or was it simply a show of force? It was just events unfolding, and many of the people dived under the trucks. The Germans weren't out to kill people. They were out out to immobilise what they thought were military targets. And this is not in any sense trying to excuse them. It was they just thought they were engaging in a military on military operation, not a military on civilian operation. I mean, civilians were collateral damage, but it wasn't out to punish civilians in any way.
No.
Okay, so I think there was somewhere about Kester may have raised a question about was it in the morning or was it in the afternoon. It was dusk, coming on for dusk. It was a June evening, so we had light until late. I mean, the scene down at the harbour, we've covered it off, but essentially just to revisit it, there were a lot of people down there because they were seeing off a boat that evacuees were on, which the boat eventually got away, didn't it, later that evening? Yeah,
it would have been one of the normal mail boats rather than one of the special evacuation ones.
That's right.
But yeah, people were still leaving at that point.
Yeah, so essentially it was an evening raid. Well, look, we've come to the end of yet another episode, Nick. A little plug for the blog.
island-fortress.com. There's lots of stuff on there that you can read and photographs, etc. And also we've got the Facebook page for that and for the podcast as well, which you can find just by putting the name of the podcast in.
Yes, you can find the podcast at Gnet Radio on Mixcloud, or go to Spotify, Amazon, Apple, and pretty much everything, and YouTube, everywhere and anywhere. Nick, you've had a great week because you've had people from the UK over you, Al Murray and James.
Yeah, I briefly managed to catch up with them for a drink and a bite to eat on Thursday evening. They had a great time. They've been recording here.
And their podcast, of course, is
We Have Ways of Making You Talk, which I highly recommend.
Yep.
They're going to have some, I think, 3 episodes out talking about the occupation coming out in the next few weeks. But from chatting to them, they had an absolutely excellent time while they were here recording. So,
well, there's been lots of pictures on Facebook of their activities. So, yes, you say they would have had a wonderful entertainment, but also, of course, it was very informative. Right, well, if you enjoy this podcast, you may wish to follow up with Gnet Radio. We are relaunching Gnet Radio or revamping it shortly, but there is music there for you to access, notably our program called Rough and Rowdy Times, which takes music from about 1920s up to the Cuban Missile Crisis, as they say. So you may wish to enjoy music of the war years and beyond. So I think, Nick, we got some specials in the pipeline. Tim Osborne, Steve Foote, possibly John Nettles in due course. Otherwise, we will be moving on to August 1941. Indeed. So, thank you for coming along, Nick, as always, and thank you for everyone that listens and follows the podcast. Both of us, Nick, we're just overwhelmed with the numbers and
we've had some great feedback. I was really lucky actually that I bumped into one of our listeners, Charlie Roberts, who frequently sends us information that he thinks might be of interest to us. And when I was down at Castle Cornet the other day, he was doing a tour around the castle,
I've heard his tours are very well received as well.
Yeah, it seemed to be going well. Managed to have a chance to have a quick chat, and I also saw him later in the week as well. So, very nice chap.
Yeah,
who knows a lot about the occupation for one so young.
Yeah, yes, indeed. In fact, both Charlie and I work for museum services here on the island. Our season finishes right at the end of October, so Charlie will be coming in to record some pieces for us in November. I think really that's everything. Apart from to say, it's 1 year ago this week that we first talked about doing this.
It is indeed, isn't it? Yeah, I think we briefly talked about it in the past. Like, it would be a really good idea if somebody did that
conceptually.
And then you said, "Oh, we happen to be having a conversation," and you said, "Why don't we actually do it?"
Yeah.
So, and we finally made the time between the two of us to actually get around to doing it. So
we are thoroughly enjoying it and finding out so much. So we've rambled on a bit, and just to say, I think we'll play out with a little bit of Jim at 5 to 7. Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
So, thank you. Bye-bye.
He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them on someone. It's 5 to 7.